Welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that we've been able to reschedule this event with Daphne Romney QC about her investigation into sexism and sexual harassment in the British Medical Association. A bit of background about Daphne. She was called to the bar and became a barrister in 1979, and she took silk in 2009. And for those of you that perhaps don't understand the British legal system, this refers to becoming a QC, which is short for Queen's Counsel. And lawyers are awarded this title on the basis of merit. And I read in Lawyer Monthly that QCs are the bee's knees of the legal world. So I'm really, really pleased that we've managed to get Daphne to come and talk to us. And silk refers to the gowns that QCs wear, and some of us in Oxford may be familiar with gowns, although we're not having many chances to get out and about with our fancy dressing up clothes on. Daphne has specialised in employment law, and in particular in discrimination and victimisation, whistleblowing and equal pay cases. She's acted for employers and employees in a number of really important cases, and some of those have centred on allegations of sexual harassment. Whilst looking up and talking to Daphne, I've also discovered that her father was a GP for over 30 years, so that gives a special connection to our Department of Primary Care Health Sciences. And I thought I would begin just by reading from the introduction of the report that Daphne wrote following her investigation into sexism and harassment at the BMA, because I think that sets the scene. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it, I think you'll understand what came next in terms of the work that Daphne did. So the Romney inquiry, as it became known, was commissioned after publication of an article in GP Online in 2019, written by two members of its General Practitioners Committee, the GPC, Dr. Zoe Norris and Dr. Kate Bramhall-Stainer. The article and subsequent interviews that they gave to national newspapers detailed what they described as the dark, dinosaur-infested depths of the world of GP politics. They complained about being called naughty and naughty girls by their colleagues, and the GPC was portrayed as misogynist, with some male doctors ignoring and disrespecting their female colleagues, making sexist remarks and talking about breast size. They also alleged there is a widespread feeling that the disciplinary systems are in place to protect establishment hierarchies and individuals who are an accepted part of the furniture, while rooting out those who challenge the status quo. And that's from the preamble to the Romney inquiry and the report that Daphne wrote. So I've prepared some questions based on my reading of the report and some of the materials around it. So Daphne, your report produced recommendations to fix the culture of the BMA, to make it the responsibility of the BMA to call out bad behaviour, some specific things about reforming committees and the way that online discussions were used, and instituting a new complaint process. I'm fascinated to understand why you agreed to take on this report, which was commissioned by the BMA, and how the process of collecting the evidence impacted on you.
Well, as I say, I'm the daughter of a GP. In fact, my dad was one of the original 1948 NHS GPs, because that's how old I am and how old he was. And so doctors have always held a sort of fascination with me, and I've done a lot of work in local authority and local health authorities. And I also did the test case for the NHS Agenda for Change on the equal pay aspects. So I thought it was interesting that it was not an appointment without interviews. So I think they asked for CVs and applications, and I put mine in. One of the criteria, which was obviously very important, was that nobody was to have any connection with the with the BMA or the GMC or anything, in order to be completely neutral. And I think there was a short list of about 7 or 8, and they gave it to me. So I just thought it would be a fascinating thing to do, because I was very interested in the whole setup, because the BMA, of course, is this very strange hybrid, because it's a members society, but it's also a trade union. And therefore it's subject to 2 sets of rules. It's subject to the ordinary rules that govern members as to the constitution, and it's also subject to the trade union rules, and that also makes it subject to sex discrimination rules as well, and race discrimination and all other sorts. So it was a very fascinating field. As to how I got to people, I remember being asked this at the interview, and you may remember, for those of you who either are members of the BMA or have looked at the history, that when Katie and Zoe wrote their article, it immediately caused a complete outcry, and the chair of the BMA immediately said that he would look into it. And then they realized that an internal investigation would not cut it, because it was not going to be neutral and there would be suspicion about it. And so having said that there would be an open investigation, he asked people to contact him with details. And when I went for my interview, I said, how many people have contacted you? He wasn't there, but how many people have contacted you, the BMA? And the answer was none. Because clearly people are not going to stick their head above the parapet to that extent, particularly as this was a complaint about the GPC, and he was the former chair of GPC, and there was a possibility even that some of it might have been about him, although it wasn't actually specifically about him. So I said, okay, I want to write a letter to everybody. So every member of the GMs, I keep saying GMC, I'm going to say it all day now, every day member of the BMA and all staff received a letter from me in which I said that I would listen to them, I would treat it with confidence, I certainly wouldn't make anything public unless they wanted me to do so, I wouldn't name names unless they wanted me to do so, and I set up my own direct inbox, which was dr@cloisters.com. They all thought that it was dr.investigation.at cloisters.com. And they all thought that meant doctors' investigations, whereas actually it was just my initials. But that way people contacted me directly. And the BMA never knew which staff contacted me, which doctors contacted me. I never gave them a list. I never told them who it was. And that's another reason for the anonymization of a lot of the incidents, because I didn't want anybody to feel that they were asking for permission. And so that's what happened. And that's how in the end I got to about 82 people who contacted me directly, some way after I'd started writing it. And also some people actually emailed me directly who didn't want to talk to me. Some members of staff emailed me with stuff about the committees they worked on, but they didn't want to make it any more public. So I thought the best and the fairest way was not to ask, but simply to invite anybody who wanted to speak to me to do so. And obviously that included heads of the major committees.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about the types of discrimination and harassment that you uncovered?
And I added an extra layer to that, actually. I decided that sometimes it wasn't clear to me whether what I was witnessing was bullying, just because they're bullying behaviours, or whether they were sexist behaviours. So I indicated, and obviously I had to expand my remit, but I let them know that I don't think I could have done it without that. So the original allegations that in Katie's article and Zoe's article, and backed up by some other people who spoke to me, were principally, first of all, they just felt treated as second-class citizens. And this is, remarkable when you think about it, because everybody who's at the BMA is a peer. That anyone who gets onto a committee is volunteering to do it. And they're not beholden to anybody, really. But there was this hierarchy that women were treated very much as second-class citizens. And there was very much, and I heard this again and again from day one, what I call in the report the Miss Triggs moment. And the Miss Triggs moment is the complaint of many women. It was based on a cartoon in Punch, and I think in the 1960s. And there's a table of men and one woman. And the woman's obviously just said something, and the man at the top of the table says, "That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men would care to make it." And that was something which senior women, junior women, and members of staff all felt that if they said something, it wasn't really listened to. But if a man said something almost identical 5 minutes later, it was, "Oh, that's a really good thing." And the listservers the same. And so it was the general denigration. It was the complaint that a lot of women made, that particularly in for some reason GPC, that there'd always be sort of, "How's your husband?" and "Does your husband mind you being here?" and "How are the children?" Now, some men might go up to other men and say, "How are the children?" But on the whole, I suspect they don't. So that was one area of it. It was just the sort of second-class nature of it. The second part was the misrepresentation in numbers. I think some 54% now of GPs are women, but less than a third on the committee were women. SASC, the specialist, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten what it is, Senior Practitioners Committee, whatever it is, they are 50-50 in practice, and only 10% on the committee, and so on. And I think there's another committee, which was the pensions committee, where there was one woman on it, and I think that was because she was ex officio. So clearly they felt underrepresented. There's never been a female chair of the BMA, and I think it's one of the only organizations of the medical societies that hasn't had a female chair. And then there was the side issue of comments. One of them started out that somebody said something along the lines of, "She's not really BMA or BMA material, but she got great tits." Now, in any area, that is, that's just, I have a series of lectures I give sometimes to people called "That Was Then, This Is Now." And I don't know if anybody last night saw the program about the Mangrove 9. Which, if you haven't, absolutely watch it. It's fantastic. And that was about policing, I wouldn't say standards, lack of standards in the 70s, and the overt racism. And again, things that people could say then, they shouldn't have even said it then, but they wouldn't dream of saying it now. You'd be sacked on the spot for saying it now. And a lot of that is the same sort of thing. You don't talk about people's tits, you don't talk about people's looks. Because they're fellow professionals, whatever they're doing. And the staff in particular, who kept using this word toxic. The staff in particular, the female staff, was sort of patted a lot, or stroked. Now, there is an ethnic minority dimension to this, that some ethnic minorities are more tactile than others, but there's a difference between stroking someone's arm in a lascivious way and just patting them or giving them a quick hug. And they felt very much, that there were a lot of very handsy people about. And just a general disrespect. One of the most startling stories was, and I think I mentioned it in the report, was a woman who had prepared all the work as a staff member for a particular committee. A fellow male member of staff who hadn't done the work but was on that same branch sat in, and all of the questions on the report were addressed to him, not to her. And she used a fabulous expression, which was something along the lines of, "It may just be low-level sexism, but it still makes you feel like crap." And it's that sort of thing. And then we come to the sexual harassment, which, as far as I could see, was almost entirely related to drink, as these things often are, and was very much a result of late night drinking at dinners and away days and conferences, where people were just basically touched up in a way that, again, it happens all over it's not just unique to doctors. It happens all over. In any office party is going to have a similar complaint. But there was a certain sort of droit de seigneur aspect of it that, senior doctors would often hit on junior doctors. And senior doctors would hit on members of staff. And there was almost an expectation, a sort of, "I pay your wages" mentality. When come upstairs, "I pay your wages." Nobody did go upstairs, as far as I can see. Or people being phoned. you know, at night in their hotel rooms at conferences, sort of, you know, so I'm in room 28, you know, so what, and put the phone down again. But as anyone, you know, in any job will know, saying no makes you scared, because what are the repercussions going to be, particularly if you're employed? And so those were the sort of general areas I discovered. And what I also discovered was just a sort of general ethos of shouting. And I think, as far as I understand it, in the NHS, and people will correct me if I'm wrong, but in the NHS, shouting has pretty much been discouraged in a way that, you know, the old Lancelot Spratt sort of area. I mean, my dad was a terrible shouter, I have to say. And I think GPs are in a slightly different position, because GPs obviously are basically self-employed. And so it's their own business, and they don't have that particular hierarchy in the same way. But I think there's a lot of learned behavior, which I discovered about that one very senior doctor said to me, well, when we started, when I started training, you were shouted at just all the time. You know, this was a guy in his sort of 50s, I think, or 60s. And you were shouted at all the time. So that's what you come to expect. And so you do it because it's learned behavior. Well, one woman, a senior woman, was shouted at to such an extent, you know, that she became actually felt physically unwell. And this is the thing, that you don't expect to be shouted at work. You shouldn't expect to be shouted at work. And you certainly shouldn't expect to be shouted at when you're not actually, in the case of the doctors, at work. You're giving up your time in order to make the career better. And so it's particularly discouraging.
So you've done lots of cases that have involved sexual harassment and bullying and these sorts of things. When I read the report, I found parts of it shocking, because I thought that this is not my colleagues, but you know, I know people that are in the BMA, and it just I just was shocked by it. And it's interesting that you talked about the sort of the low level kind of sexism that people almost tolerate, but some of the examples you've given are you know, I still find them shocking. Were you shocked by what you found, or was it the kinds of things you were expecting because it's what you've seen in your legal practice?
I was a bit shocked, because some of it was just so 1960s, you know, it was and 1970s. You know, it was like that Gene Hunt thing, whatever that program was called, with John Sims. It's gone out of my head. You know the one I mean. Because it was stuff like calling people little ladies, you know, expecting, if there was a woman in the room, no matter how senior, she'd be the one who'd ask to, you know, to make the tea or pour the tea. It was university graduates, women, being told, oh, you know, what would you like to come and work for me as my secretary? And I was like, nothing wrong with being a secretary, but these are not secretaries, and yet their degree of learning and expertise was completely overwhelmed. I did find some of the proportions on the committee pretty amazing as well, and the amount of women, and these are, you know, very talented, oh god, I sound like Donald Trump, very talented, very intelligent women who consider themselves to be strong women, who've taken a lot of nonsense. And as far as I can see, a lot of the older doctors, women doctors, had been through a culture in the NHS where it was pretty much expected of them to cooperate in whatever way was asked with male consultants to get on various training programs. But they found, as I say, including this woman who was shouted at, they found themselves just rather completely worn down on it. And a lot of them were not just in tears when they were shouted at. And there's a story of one woman going into the loo and finding another very senior woman in tears, crying her eyes out in the loo because she'd just been shouted at. But it's also the fact that even when they were telling me about these incidents, they were tearful. A lot of women were tearful. And that I thought was quite shocking, in something where they're doing it as a volunteer thing. Now, that is not unusual for unions. As you all know, and this is a union, but it's so much not the same sort of atmosphere that it would be. I was surprised that degree went on.
And I suppose one of the controversial bits of your recommendations is the, and you touched on the lack of representation of women on the committees, and you propose using quotas. And I was interested to read that, and I wondered whether you've always believed that quotas are good, or that you felt that quotas were particularly useful in this setting. And I just, because I know that that's an area that people feel is controversial for some people.
Yeah. I think, to be honest, I've always been very wary of quotas, partly because I think they engender such distrust. And you'll remember as well that they can be quite, legally tricky. And you remember when the Labour Party originally had all female shortlists, and it was held to be unlawful, and they had to pass an act in order to allow it. But I do think that having looked very hard at the recommendations that I wanted to make, and I had a completely free rein, I felt I could almost recommend anything, but Daphne Romney must be treated first in any hospital or something. But I did think that there wasn't any other way that was going to come about. And there are various reasons for that. And that does go hand in hand with various other recommendations I made, like limiting the number of terms that people can be on there. And I see, by the way, that there's a very similar feeling now with the US Senate, that some people have been there for 40, for 50 years, they're in their 80s and they're still sort of toddling about. And I think the combination of that, and particularly with GPC, the system where if you come from a local committee, you're going to be on there forever, because they'll just keep voting for you, and you're never really going to be challenged, because that's your seat. It's actually known as Bob's seat or John's seat. I thought the combination of that means you've just got to break the logjam, and there wasn't any other way of doing it. I think it should be done for as short a period as possible, because I think, that you get they're only there because mindset. But I think if it encourages women to think that they've got a good chance, then that's something which I think helps.
Yeah. And you're obviously very used to dealing with powerful organizations, and you work in in a setting that is also hierarchical and has lots of powerful people in it. But I wondered what happened after you delivered the report. When we were talking before this event opened, you said that it was gratifying to see the ways that the commissioners of the report and the inquiry took your findings on. Can you tell us a bit about how you've been involved in that, and perhaps anything that's highlights of what's happened since?
Yes, I gave an oral presentation to the board to start with, and I gave them anonymized but quite detailed examples of things that people had said, and examples of sexual harassment. Things that had happened in, the hotel bar late at night and so on. And their faces were a picture. I mean, they really were. And very senior people with their mouths dropping open. And they were embarrassed. And I think they were disturbed, and they were also upset that this was their colleagues. So I think that began to, I'm not saying they didn't take it seriously to start with, I'm sure that they did, but when you bring it home, the specific examples, that it's not just women talking about, being asked how their kids are, it's just being made to feel completely, excluded. I think they took that very seriously. I also put together, because I wasn't actually able to attend in person, an hour-long recorded summary of the report for council, which is the main body, which is a pretty large body that sits with elected from all the different branches, and again laid it down exactly what the problems were. And I, as you can see, I didn't really mince my words in the draft, and I wasn't prevailed upon to take anything out. And I wasn't asked, I was only asked actually to put something in, and that was one particular recommendation. I can't remember what it was, because several of the senior women wanted that recommendation in. But I did write it in such a way that people would take notice, because otherwise it would just be some other piece of paper. And I think the other thing I was really surprised about, although I wasn't surprised about, is that I think every organisation has training, equal opportunities training, and quite often it's a tick box thing on a computer, and you know, you do it whilst you got the telly on, basically. Life on Mars. So I just remember, I remember that. You know, so whether you're watching Life on Mars or football or whatever it is, and you just tick, you know, yes, no, number 4, number 5, or whatever. And I think people don't take it seriously. I also think there's a lot of things with, and you saw this recently with die-hard Tory MPs, do you remember, who are absolutely infuriated at the idea that they were going to have awareness training, and they were describing it as woke and fascism and all sorts of other nonsense. It's often the people who most need it who are the most, you know, resentful for having it. And my view was, well, if you don't like it, off you go. You know, there's the resignation letter, write it, off you go. But I think you can't represent other people unless you do have some understanding of what causes offence, things that you can and can't say, attitudes that you really, and a lot of it I think is unwitting. I mean, just for example, a lot of women have families. So they may not come up the night before. They may come up for a meeting in the morning, depending on how far they're coming, but they may just get up very early and 5 o'clock, and they'll get the 6 o'clock train to be there, you know, in time for an 8:30 or 9 o'clock start. But a lot of the guys, or presumably single women, but a lot of the guys will get there the night before. And so they all go out for dinner. They have an allowance, and they go out for dinner and they talk. And quite often the conversation can be a bit fruity, so that some women who've been at those dinners have just been embarrassed by the tenor of the conversation. But quite often they actually say, well, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? So that when the women arrive the next day for these meetings, they find that a lot of it's already been discussed. And their contributions are of less value because they've basically thrashed it out the night before. So it's things, just stupid things like timings of meetings. You know, meetings during the day are less likely to be attended. And of course, there are financial consequences as well in some cases. So that's the sort of unwitting. And the other thing is, of course, the very typical thing that people tend to gravitate towards people who look like them, think like them. And sometimes, particularly with some of the older doctors, possibly lots of young women are seen. It's the way men talk about women as well, isn't it? That women are often described as pushy. If any man who's listening to this would like to tell me when he's ever been described as pushy, I'll be interested. Or hysterical, of course, which is anyway, of course, a word emanating from the womb. But it's these words that you only get used about women. And the other one that caused great offence was, oh, she's mad, meaning she's ditzy, or she's, you know, strange, or she's eccentric, or she wears a silly hat or something. Well, who cares what hat you're wearing? And so it's this sort of attitude that I don't think is even conscious, but it's the unconscious attitude that causes a lot of offence.
And I think having concrete examples in the report, I think, so that people can see what those examples are. So you talk a lot about banter and about the way the old boys club works. And I think you know, it's really helpful to be able to see the examples and also to explain that the norms have changed, that, you know, the world of Life on Mars or Mad Men or whatever it is, that's not the expectations now, and that
and of course the other thing which I think does matter is that old boys club, even without the sexual connotation, was the disciplinary system, which was already being changed when I got there, because it was investigated internally. And frankly, with the very best of intentions, that's going to look suspicious, because it's investigated by people who work in the building with people who are being investigated. And the disciplinary commission tended to be drawn from, and it's all set out in a particular rule which they tried to change and they couldn't, because it was turned down at council. But the people who are listening to it were mates often with the people who are being complained about. And so one of the additional recommendations I made was not to have people. It's much more convenient to have people, you know, and you can phone them up and say, can you sit on such and such? And as you know, trying to get 3 people on the same date, it's impossible for anything. But what was important was to, you know, a lot of guys out there and women out there who are members of the BMA probably sit on their own health association, health boards, commission, you know, disciplinary boards or grievance boards, or some of them probably sit on GMC boards. And so why can't those people, and some of them are probably magistrates for goodness sake, so why can't those people who don't have any direct knowledge of the complainant and or the person complained of come in? And that is something, again, that's going to be brought in. And the other thing was, because of GDPR, and also because of a desire not to, as it were, get a doctor too much publicity so that they might get, you know, shopped to the GMC or spitefully passed on, because there's quite a lot of malice floating around in that building sometimes. Disciplinary hearings are always in private. And not just that, the results are never made public except to counsel. And so there was a perception, particularly among staff, that what was the point of complaining, because nothing seemed to be done by it. Very few people are ever slung out of the BMA. And so people were not using the system because they just didn't think there was any point in it.
Yeah, that lack of trust is really important, isn't it? So going back to the opening of your report, you had this lovely quote where you said, a woman doctor had said to you, "I just want to be proud of my trade union." Do you think, with the actions that have been taken since your inquiry and your report, that doctors can now be proud of the BMA?
The moment she said that, I said to her, that's the opening line of my report. Yes, I think they've made a lot of progress. First of all, as I say, they've completely changed, partly because they were going to anyway, then the additional things that I've recommended. They've changed the disciplinary commission. They've got all female, a female committee. I don't think they've yet brought in the quotas. I think that's one that's going to probably cause the most debate. But they have a speak up champion. They have the training that I suggested. They have active bystander training, which I think is extremely important. And I think the atmosphere is changing. It's not going to change overnight. Of course it's not. But I think there is now more faith that people will be heard and people will be taken more seriously. One or two people have probably just thought, woke and gone. But if they've gone, they've gone. You know, that's a matter for them. But I think people will have more faith in getting involved, because one thing that really, again, you asked me what shocked me. A lot of what shocked me was that a lot of women who had a lot to offer just couldn't take it anymore and went. And so all that young and even not so young energy and effort and commitment was lost because people were just not interested in staying because it was not worth the candle. And I think that was really quite shocking, all that talent that just decided to give up and go elsewhere. And the profession's changing so much anyway. What I think also will make a difference in the coming years is that locums used to be almost entirely women. And as I said, a lot of GPs who are then paying the locums, so that there were no, that's a problem on GMC, that you have actually employer and employee GPC on the same committee, thought that they weren't real doctors because they weren't working full time. And now, of course, a lot of doctors have portfolio careers. And they don't want to have all the admin stuff. I remember my dad, who was a sole practitioner, then moved into a health centre. And even then used to come back and I didn't come into this job to do all this stupid paperwork. You know, that just it wasn't what he wanted to be a doctor for. And I think a lot of people, therefore, men are becoming locums, and that there's a huge change in the demographic of that particular job. And so I think that will make things easier as well, when people actually suddenly see that you want to work part-time because you want work-life balance, because you want to do other parts of the job, because you want to do, I don't know, ballroom dancing on a Thursday afternoon, whatever it is. And that, I think, will also make a change.
So broadening out, and I've got a question from Julia Hitzicotts in our department, which will roll in, I think, to something else that I wanted to ask you, just to kind of broaden out, thinking about the fact that we've been gripped by the pandemic. You mentioned Trump and some of the things that have been going on in the US. We've got equalities that we're perhaps more aware of, or we're aware that particular groups, frontline staff, ethnic minorities have been affected by the pandemic. And we've been doing quite a bit of work in the medical sciences division, the university, and in our department to think about sort of social justice issues and some of these issues around gender equality. And I just wondered if you could help us think through whether there's particular learning from your report that you think we might want to pay attention to in a university setting, in a world where we're trying to address some of those issues about the kinds of ways that harassment and discrimination and bullying feed into injustice and inequality.
I think that there are a number of things. First of all, some women are just less like, I think this is not so much true of the younger generation. Of course, more and more women, like law, more and more women are coming into medicine now. So as I understand it, the input of training is very much bent towards women rather than men. But certainly older women, for the reasons I've said, preconditions or preconditioned thinking about seem to be pushy, for example, means that women don't talk themselves up in the same way. And it's very much the same as for women applying for Silk, actually. There's a very small number of women QCs. I became a QC in 2009. I was only the 201st ever female QC, starting from 1949 was the first one. Because in interviews, women tend to say, well, I did that quite well. Whereas men will say, I smashed it. You know, it's that talking up. So women don't talk themselves up. I think they have to be given the opportunity to put themselves forward a bit more. Also, I think there's a bit of silo mentality that if you're not on a certain committee and or you're not in a certain area of work and you don't therefore know that work, you're not very likely to apply for that work. Because whereas a man might look at, you know, the attributes needed for the job and say, put the person spec and say, well, I've got 4 of them, so I haven't got the other 3, but what the hell? And women, oh, I haven't got all 7, I can't do that. There's a lot of evidence that women who apply for a job and don't get it, then don't apply again. Because, and presumably standing is very much the same sort of thing. Whereas men will have another go. So I think there's a certain element about that. There's the perception about women with children, which of course leads to inequality. And I think there's also this area of just very hard to break into areas where you haven't broken into before. So I think that's why there has to be, I refer to something called taster days on committees, where people are allowed just to come along and not just sit in, and because obviously people can come and watch, but people can actually sit in on deliberations of the committees and see what work they do, so they can get a little idea as to whether or not they're used to it. I know that one thing that GPC does is every year they co-opt somebody onto the committee who's never been on that committee before, in an effect, you know, in an attempt to get people in. So I think it's about, I hate this word inclusive in a way because it sounds very patronizing, but I think it's about making people feel welcome to apply, and also giving them the opportunity to get the knowledge and experience and confidence that will then allow them to apply. Because the evidence actually is that when women do stand for committees, they tend to be elected. But one thing that happens, particularly in the local LMCs for the GPs, is that, as I say, people are there for so long that it's almost seen like an act of treason to challenge them. And so in the end, you're not going to do that. And so the same people keep coming back and back and back again, like the senators who've been senators for 40, 50 years. And they're log jamming. And when you don't have fresh thought coming in, you get the same things repeated again and again.
So I think there's, so to answer some of the questions that I'm reading in the chat, I think there are some structures in Oxford and in universities that are similar to the things you found, but the sorts of things that you've suggested are very practical suggestions for what we can do. So I've got another question, which is, do you think that with the new movement of feminism, we'll see some change in boards or senior committees with more women occupying seats on committees? And have you noticed that change since the start of, well, I think the question is, have you noticed it yourself in your career? Have you noticed that feminism has perhaps empowered women to stand for committees and be more actively involved?
In the law, I'm not really sure that's right. There's still a tremendous imbalance of people of judges, for example, male to female, and the ethnic balance is even, you know, more striking. I was on a committee recently where we actually had a meeting for junior, i.e. not QC, women, to try and encourage more people to apply for SILT, because in the same way as I've just described, a lot of people, for example, when they see on this ridiculously long form, it's about 80 pages, what are your important cases? They think, oh, I don't do important cases, or what's an important case? And we had somebody along from the QC selection panel who would actually say, look, what we mean is this and what we mean is that. We did find that it's in certain sorts of cases, for example, transfer of undertaking cases, they're almost always done by men on both sides. You know, there's certain sort of cases where women are called in, and certain sort of where men are just reluctant to give women, particularly again in things like restrictive covenant cases and commercial cases, the vast majority of that seem more like men's work. It's like going back to my equal pay cases in the council, where, you know, women do the caring jobs and men do the heavy lifting. And so I think that there is quite an element of that. I think you look at directors. I mean, I wrote about this and I wrote my book on equal pay. The city had several reports which said we want to see in the FTSE 100 and 200, we want to see at least 1/3 of directors being women by a certain period. And they're actually pretty much nearly got there. Again, because of the active encouragement and the spotlight being shone rather, on the lack of diversification in there. So I think I'm hoping that certainly there have been some deputy chairs of the BMA who've been women, but not chairs who've been women. And I think one of the problems again is this. It usually happens, I think there was somebody from public health, which of course now is ever so sexy, but it used to happen that, and pretty much does, that either you are from the consultants committee or you're from the GBC, and it's one turn and then another. So presumably after the current chair, who's a GP, there'll be somebody from the consultants committee. If the imbalance is such on the two big committees, the consultants committee or the GP committee, of men, and men tend to vote for men rather than women, you're never going to get a female chair of either committee, which means you're not very likely to get a female chair of the BMA. That's the sort of Buggins' turn mentality that really has to change.
Yeah, and I mean, like you, I think I was ambivalent about quotas, and I was quite interested in the arguments against quotas, but seeing how powerful they can be for just making that tipping, so that you start to get it becoming more normalised that women are in those
it's
positions.
adjusting the norm, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you see a woman, you know, we've now had 2 women prime ministers, and, you know, okay, now we've got a woman prime minister. It's not a big deal. We've had, you know, women this, that, and the other. And once you see that, once you see women heads of colleges that used to be male, you think, oh, okay, well that's done then. And so it's just getting used to this, you know, by making it happen. And then once it's happened, it's happened. I mean, I'm so old that, you know, when I went up to Cambridge, there were only 3 colleges that took women and 3 that were mixed. And, you know, there are all these arguments you may remember about, oh, we'll have to change the toilets, and it's always the toilets, and, you know, now it's something else. Well, they changed the toilets, and, you know, from now 6 colleges, my college, Newnham, is as far as I can see, one of the only ones that's still all female. And that's fine, because if some people want that, that's great. But nobody now would blink an eyelid, you know, bat an eyelid at the idea of a mixed college. It's just something you have to ease into, and just show people that actually nobody's head's going to fall off if it happens.
So I've got another question in the chat, which is this job done, or is there a lot more work to do? And if so, who should do it?
In the BMA?
In the BMA, but I guess, you know, in your legal work, there's a lot of other cases,
there is a lot of
other areas where these things go on.
To do, and I may go in and do a follow-up report just to see what's happened if I'm invited to do so. But I think you have to keep pushing. There have been quite a few of these reports You may remember there was one done about the House of Commons, which is an unusual situation because of MPs don't employ House of Commons staff; they're not their own staff. And sometimes it's a disconnect between the various rules of employment and not employment. But there were certainly 2 reports done on the House of Commons, one by Laura Cox, Dame Laura Cox, one by Gemma White. There was one by the House of Lords, and again, all the similar stories are rolled out. You know, it's like when I was doing my equal pay cases, you just knew which of the men and which of the women manual workers were getting what. You knew who were getting the bonuses, and you know, spoiler, it wasn't the women. And so these stories, whether it's a large bank or whether it's a trade union or whether it's a medical association, the same stories will often appear. Alcohol certainly plays a part in sexual harassment, but it's not always that. It's just this idea that, you know, women are there to be touched. Well, they're not.
And I was reminded in with the death of Peter Sutcliffe this week that you know, my formative years were spent with women marching to reclaim the night and reclaim the streets, because you know, certainly my teenage years, we were told that we would be safer if we stayed at home because there was a man out there attacking people, and nobody told the men to stay at home. So I think there's some really interesting shifts in the expectations, and the things that the police said back then, I think, you know, are clearly being apologised for now and have been challenged. And
I was listening to, I think it was Nick Ferrari this morning on the radio, who was sort of saying, well, why on earth should these people have to apologise for an attitude that was common then? But again, watching this, and I again urge everybody to watch it, the Mangrove 9 programme last night, you know, it's because people who were treated like that want to feel that somebody recognises that it was wrong, you know, and it's not a question of compensation or it's just, yes, you know what, that was wrong, and we're trying not to do it anymore, just to make people feel that we've moved on and become a more civilised and equitable society. And some people I know just think that's incredibly woke. And you know, you can't, you know, and then it comes back to this, oh, you can't make a joke anymore. This is where we come back to the banter thing. You know, the whole thing about banter is that often banter is not laughing with someone, it's laughing at someone. And, you know, if you ever stop to ask the person, honestly, do you think this is funny? They wouldn't, but they're not going to say that. And sometimes they join in because they have to. There's a lot of sexual harassment cases of, oh, you know, she never said anything, or she was laughing and making jokes as well. Well, sometimes you do, just because it's that, or be seen as
So there's an interesting question here, which is, what do you think about the mum or nanny spoiling all the boys' fun? When women are seen as the killjoys in these sorts of situations, you know, so that banter is part of the, you know, it's the fun around the edges of the meeting, and it's
how very dare these women come in and make it miserable. Sorry guys, you know, that was then, this is now. Think of all the words, and I'm certainly not going to repeat them, you won't ask me about, but think of all the words that our parents used to use. Even last week, that ridiculous dinosaur from the FA, you know, talking about people who were coloured and things that you used to be able to say, you can't say now. And I'm sorry, but if you want to go to the pub and, you know, chat like that, fine. But if other people find it offensive, it's not okay. And the idea that people have to adapt to your level rather than you adapting to a different level, of a different standard, is crazy. And you may see in the report there was a quote which I was very struck by, about how women were told that they had, particularly staff, this was a staff quote, about women were told they had to be resilient. You know, they had to learn to be resilient. And one woman left because she said, I keep being told I have to learn to be resilient. I don't want to be resilient. I'd rather work somewhere where this doesn't happen. And the BMA is very well paid, by the way, the jobs that these people do. And they often leave to go to a lesser paid job or no job because they don't want to work in this toxic atmosphere. So the idea that you have to sort of harden up in order to work somewhere Why should you have to do that? Why don't people have to soften down to take account of your feelings, and then say whatever it was, you know, they want to say with people who are like-minded and will enjoy it? It's exclusive behaviour.
Yeah, there's linked to that sort of idea about getting people to change their behaviours. Somebody's asked a question about, we spend a lot of time agonising whether training should be mandatory or not. And what's your experience of the mandatory or voluntary training to get those behaviours to change?
Look, I recognise that quite often if you force somebody to have training, they're going to resent it. And if they're sitting here, you know, like that, one of the things that I do, that some guys in my chambers have got a witness training program. That doesn't mean you tell the witness what to say, but training into how to give evidence, you know, how not to bristle at the idea of being questioned, which a lot of very senior people do. And some people turn up and they're really interested in it. Some people turn up, they're neutral, they really get interested in it. Some people turn up, you know, like that, crossed arms. And why am I here? What a waste of my time. So obviously they're not going to get anything out of that training because they've just decided in advance it's a waste of their time and they could be doing something more valuable. But I did make it a recommendation of compulsory training for everybody, because I actually think you're never too clever or too experienced to learn something new. And I gave that was then, this is now, taught to a very senior group of solicitors, partners in a very big, very successful firm. And, you know, they're all lawyers. Not all of them were employment lawyers. Most of them weren't. And a lot of them at the end said, oh, you know, it really made me think. I didn't realize that. So sometimes you don't want to hear things. I mean, you know, if somebody gives me feedback that I don't like, I don't enjoy it. But you think, actually, I did do that. Actually, I did talk over that person in that. Oh God, you know, and it's not nice to have to think that maybe you've done something in a way that might have offended people. But if you have, don't you want to know that?
Yeah. And there's also, I think a lot of that has come out with the, you know, the Black Lives Matter and some of the racial and ethnic minority justice issues. For me, as a white woman, I think I found a lot of those very personally challenging and making me think about behaviours or omissions of behaviours, and this idea that if we're going to address these things, we might have to give up our own power in order to make a better world or a more just world. And what does that look like, and how can you work towards it? So linked to that, there's a lovely question here that's about getting more women in leadership positions and getting more women on committees, but that might not necessarily equate to less bullying and a more progressive organisation, because senior women may bully people also. Do you have a take on that?
Of course they might. And the bullying part of my report was not just about men bullying women. And senior women have been known, you know, to bully men in just the same way. There's something about power, which, you know, everybody sort of quite enjoys having it. And medicine has always been very hierarchical. It's probably less so now. But certainly I think in private practices and things where you're not necessarily answerable to anybody in the same way, it's still something that you expect things of people, and it's the same with any employment situation. But yes, there will be bullying, and if it's bullying, it should be called out, whoever's doing it. One of the things about the BMA was that one of the reasons there wasn't a lot of calling out was because, in addition to being a members association, this was a trade union and people were being voted for. And there are all sorts of factions, as in any other business. There's, you know, the radical left faction, there's this faction, the APP faction, the various ethnic minority factions. And in order to curry their vote, you've got to be nice to them. So if you say, oi, you know, you were a horrible bully just now, what do you think, you know, that was really sexist? They're not going to vote for you, and they're going to tell all their friends that you're very woke and very ridiculous, and they're not going to vote for you, and then you're not going to be chair of that committee anymore. So you know, to some extent, it's a matter of calling it out. Whoever's doing it, it's no more acceptable for a woman to shout than a man. Absolutely none. And I'm not saying that, I don't even know what the statistics of it are, but shouting is just not acceptable at work, whoever does it. It's just not acceptable anymore.
So I have a question here, which is, do you think the medical profession was worse or different to other professions? You've mentioned the hierarchy, and that's a common feature of particular of the established professions, but...
Well, you know, somebody explained this to me, and I was thinking back to my own dad actually about this as well. And when you're a doctor, you are trained that you have absolute confidence in your own judgment, or you would not be able to do that job. You know, particularly if you're working alone, like a GP. Somebody comes in and says, I've got this mole, or, you know, I've got this pain, or I've got this twinge. And you've got your 8 minutes or your 10 minutes or whatever it is to make a decision as to whether or not it's serious, or it's just something which you can put a bit of Betlavate on and, you know, Bob's your uncle. So you have to trust your own opinion. You have to trust your own opinion as a doctor. And so you're taught very early on to trust your own opinion. And the trouble with trusting your own opinion, otherwise you can't function, you'll either have a complete nervous breakdown or you just won't be very good, is that you then trust your own opinion about everything else. And you stop really listening to other people's point of view. And I think that was very much a thing about the list servers. You know, instead of just saying, well, I don't agree, it's you're talking rubbish, in a tone that gets people down. And often, as we all know, email or any sort of written thing doesn't always necessarily carry the meaning it's supposed to, because unless you put an emoji in it, you can't actually tell if somebody's serious or not. So I think that there is an element of that. I think the medical profession, as I say, because it is trained to be right, and to trust your judgment on a very rapid basis of an analysis, I think leads to a position where you're not that happy to be told you're not right. It's just part of the training.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and that was fascinating. And I can see that there's another couple of questions that we could have asked, but apologies that we didn't get to them. I've got a few people to thank. I'd like to thank those of you that did post some questions, and for everyone that joined in today. I particularly want to thank Catherine Jennings and Kirsty Jackson and my colleagues in the Better Workplace group, which is our group in our department that are trying to make our workplace better. And one of the things we want to do is address the very, very small percentage of bullying and harassment reports that we get every year and make our workplace better. I'd like to thank your colleague Frankie Beale in Cloisters Law for all the help behind the scenes, putting this event together and helping us get here today. I'd like the audience here to look out for future talks, because we hope that this will be a series. There will be some internal events in the department, but also we hope some more public events like this where we take these messages more widely. And Daphne, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences and the Medical Sciences Division and the University of Oxford for sharing your time with us today and telling us some more about your fantastic report that has made it such a huge difference. So I think we can probably extend our thanks on behalf of colleagues in medicine, members of the BMA and the doctors of the future, and the many women who have and will continue to benefit from your work. We owe you a huge debt of gratitude, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.